Hello, to this video is called Moving and Clean the Streets of Ottawa. Bouncy castles have happened. This is my point of view of part 2 of day 25th, public inquiry to the federal government for invoking the Emergency Act on February 2022 that took place on November 17, and today is November 20th, 2022. I am going to talk only about Jody Thomas, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor for the Prime Minister. So obviously the objective is going to be to create a narrative to make this protest not peaceful in order to be able to invoke the act. So this position was created after 9/11, and she was appointed directly by the Prime Minister on January 11 of 2022, so very shortly before this happened. And her role is to collect information from different sources. So she uses information from CSIS, RCMP, CSC, or agencies, including what is called the Five Eyes, that is UK, Australia, USA, New Zealand, and Canada, as well as social media. So you can see that on January 25th, all the communications that were being shared internally were talking about the fact that this was a lawful protest. So clearly there was nothing that could be done to, quote, stop the protest. And it actually made me think about these images that have been circulating in the last 2 years, on which there is a person saying that is peaceful, but you can see is clearly not. And I'm wondering if the function of this is to make sure that no surveillance can take place once you say is peaceful. So if there's any type of infiltration from the government, nothing can be proven in that context. Here you can see how the online surveillance was not structured at this time. And my question is it now? Because you can see from the notes who has the authority to pay attention to the online space and chatter, and these were her own notes. So pay attention clearly sounds to me like a surveillance. So she said, the way things are done now is the online world. It's not about tapping phones anymore. So how do you receive and assess this information in a legal manner? So you can see how she is going to try to create that framework to continue surveillance over the citizens. The illegal and criminal storyline needed to be created to end the protest. So after the weekend, we realized they were going to stay for a long time. And we're meeting daily to understand how could we end this protest. So remember, the protest is legal. It cannot be ended. And we're going to see exact wording of the legislation in a minute. So the only way to end it was to call it illegal. On a meeting from February 6, was the federal government trying to wash their hands from what was happening? And her answer was absolutely not. Looking at the context of what was happening, the streets and the intelligence, looking at the federal laws to remove the rigs. We were looking at how to make the truckers leave Ottawa and use the provincial laws to enforce, to clear the streets. So notice the approach of the government is not to try to seek to understand, but they just want to end, and they use the word enforced. And enforced is actually something that needs to be done as a compulsory action in a matter of using force. So these people do not represent us. They just hold secret meetings against us, and they don't like when we express our disagreement or misalignment with the mandates or directions that are given upon our bodies. So here the question was, what was your role at the IRG meetings? Remember, those are the secret meetings that are presided by the Prime Minister. To provide a factual base threat report, nor advice or recommendation. And then the answer was, without betraying what was said at the meetings, I gave an overview of the entire nation. So you can see, even in the context of the inquiry that seeks to understand the specific details as to if this Emergency Act was invoked in the framework allowed or not, the information is not being provided. So my question is, what are we doing here? If you're not going to answer the questions because of your confidentiality umbrella, then we really can't know what happened. Another question was, give me an example of the difference between overview and advice. Overview is when I say, for example, the protesters are planning to stay on our weekend, and advice would be to say the RCMP should move in right now and clean the streets of Ottawa. That's my title number 1, because clearly they talk about us as if we are garbage. That's the way you talk about garbage. This is how it was discussed in the IRG meetings. And you can see a couple of important things. Number one, the title on the top says secret, and the title on the side of each page. And you can see it in both English and French here. It says Confidence of the Queen's Private Council. So remember that every single part of those discussions are secret. All the documents provided to inquiry are highly redacted, and they shouldn't be. Look at the agenda. Progress on federal actions, targeted situational update, and key communications. What is so secret about it? Nothing should be so secret. We want to know. Page 7, completely redacted. Page 8, completely redacted. Page 9, the only thing we can read here is wrap-up and conclusion. So my question is, what was discussed there? Pretty scary when you think about it. And then we see in the bottom some information with the title Enforcement Actions Without Current Legal Authorities. So it's obviously redacted because they're discussing how to go outside of the law to control the money. And you can see the timeline immediately. Continue assessing in short term. So they're coming after the money. And again, remember the definition of enforcement. Here they're talking about further define and elaborate on potential consequences for protesters, enforcement actions. So remember, it's not enough to close the protest. It's not enough to allow people to leave. They want for them to have consequences. And the reason is simple. They don't want this to be repeated. They said in the testimony, oh yes, the lawful protests are allowed. They don't want any protests. They want for you and for us to obey without any type of challenge. So here we continue seeing the other options. Here it says, assess utility of other tools that do not require invoking the Emergency Act. What is interesting is that they also redacted this. So if I'm in a court of law and I'm trying to prove that the Emergency Act was required to be invoked, the first thing I would do would be to volunteer the information of all the other avenues that I contemplated and the reasons why they needed to be discarded. But they're not providing that. So this is what was provided to the inquiry, and clearly they don't want us to know much. Page 17, page 18. So words are very important as well, not only about the secrecy, but what they say in the stand. So here, Jody said, we had no clarity of who would be the leader. We had no clarity of what their ask was. Clearly, that's not true, because from day one, before arriving in Ottawa, while being in Ottawa, and even after the whole thing has finished, we have always heard the consistent message of we want the mandates to end, not only for us, but for everyone in Canada. But this is how they express about us. These are Jody's words. The massive humanity that was on the streets of Ottawa. This was about 30 minutes before the afternoon break, for those of you who have the inclination to go to the original footage, because the wording is really odd and, to be perfectly honest, is disturbing. Why would she use that word? It's just incredible. Question, in that meeting of February 11, did you provide a view of what to do? Yes. And your view was? Oh, it is protected. So you can see how the rules protect the government, but the rules are not protecting the protesters who were subpoenaed to testify in this inquiry with words that very likely will be used against them. So here, when she said it is protected, she smiled. And for those of you that do a little bit of research on body language, that is actually called dupe delight. That is the pleasure of being able to manipulate someone, often made visible to others by flashing a smile at an inappropriate moment. So it's just very interesting to see all these people. In the meeting notes from February 12, from the IRG meeting, that remember is the private and confidential and secret meeting, it explains the boldness in the protest. And I say boldness, but obviously is not such a thing. The question was, in Ottawa, we are seeing a significant escalation in the boldness of protesters. So the question was to Jody, what does that mean? And she answered, well, we were hearing from OPS, social media, and the media. Bouncy castles had happened. That's my second title, because how can you possibly say that? Is that your definition of violence? Is that your definition of being more bold in the protest? And she used the words, it was an increase on the low level of violence. What does that even mean? There are not degrees of violence. It's in the criminal code or it's not in the criminal code. There is no in between. So clearly you can see how the rhetoric is being used in a very manipulative manner. In spite of a clear plan of action, the plan existence is denied consistently throughout her testimony. So Jody said that it was a lot of plans that had been told about, but they were not credible. And for her, credible are the ones that have the intention and the capability to follow through with this specific, not threat, but with the plan itself. So here you can see from the notes, the city of Ottawa announced agreement with the protest leader Tamara Lich, which could lead to approximately 70% of trucks and cars leave their residential areas in the downtown core over the next 24 hours. So clearly, the intelligence is not very intelligent, because Tamara Lich, we know, it was never the leader. She was just playing a very visible role in the GoFundMe role. But here you have a task, you have a responsible, you have a concrete outcome, you have a deadline. How is that not sufficient? That is pretty straight and is very clear, particularly given the importance of what they are telling to be done. You want the people out of the residential areas. They're saying we're out, 70% is a lot, and in 24 hours, that's pretty fast. So they continued. Question, when was the cabinet informed there was a plan in Ottawa? I don't recall cabinet being informed of that. There was no evidence that there was a plan. So she was asked what is evidence, the assurance that the RCMP, that is achievable. But here you can see from the full cabinet notes on February 13, 2022, you can see how the OPS has approved a joint operational plan for Ottawa developed with support from RCMP and OPP, and will be put into action in coming days. So I don't like that here is a little bit of a loose timeline, but you're saying in the full cabinet on February 13, OPS, RCMP, OPP, the three major branches of the policing of the area are telling you there is a plan and it has been approved, but they said there is no plan. So clearly is the need to say there was no plan, therefore we need to do the Emergency Act. Here, obviously, we know, or at least I believe this is true, organizers noted that the presence of firearms may have been planted to discredit the protest. Of course, I walked in Ottawa. I have been in many protests and I have never felt unsafe. I've never seen people with guns. People are very passionate. People are very vocal. People obviously are having flags and they are wearing whatever t-shirts or whatever they're doing. But aggressions and violence, I have never seen, and I have been in at least 10 protests in Ottawa, combining Ottawa, Quebec, Montreal, and never have I seen anything like that. Her emails from February 14 show she was actively looking for the narrative to support the invocation of the act. You can see here the visual from 1144, and she's saying, I need an assessment, the characters involved, the weapons, the motivations. Clearly, this isn't about COVID. This is a very short fuse. So you can see how she is literally finding information that will support the invocation of the act at 12:05, so very shortly after. This is about a national threat to our national interest by people who don't care about or understand democracy, are preparing to be violent. How do you know? Who are motivated by anti-government sentiment. What anti-government sentiment? If anything, the convoy was ratifying the government by saying, we want to speak with you. And obviously there was no coordinated effort, because we have heard multiple times, including from the police officers, that there was not a unique leader. So it's not coordinated. Even she said there was not one leader. So that narrative is completely false, and she knows it. Jody said the request of protesters was unacceptable. The desire of having the law changed by force, the mandates. First off, a mandate is not the law, Jody. And then second, you can, and in fact, change the financial framework and the law about it quite rapidly when you wanted to gain control of the GoFundMe money. So when it's for you and for the government, it works because it's more control, and that is okay. But when it's more autonomy for us, that is not okay. You say, we do not understand democracy, and I think it's you who doesn't understand it, because democracy is the will of the people, and the majority was talking. Now you're representing the minority. Clearly, we know the people who stood by the bridges at -22, who went to Ottawa at -25, and the people who wanted to protest and sleep in trucks at -25, -30 degrees. Clearly, that's the majority, not the minority. However, this is the worst part of the whole testimony. That's how I see it. There were people on the ground ready to be violent and had anti-government sentiment. The CSIS had concerns for potential violence. First of all, no, they were not ready to be violent. How do you know? anti-government sentiment. How do you know how they feel? You don't know how people feel. And CSIS always put in writing there was no concerns for any violence. So the question was this the sentiment about the situation on the ground? And she responded, not everyone, but there was the potential. You see, they keep on talking about the potential, but the potential is not real. The potential is in your head. It's not on the ground. Was this assessment ever produced to you? She asked the commission counselor. No. And the question was, why not? Well, it fell through the cracks and we were overtaken by events. It fell through the cracks? So what you're telling me is that you never received information to say that there was anything potentially enough to support the invocation of the act, and that's why you were sending those emails desperately trying to produce the proof that it was required. That's what I'm hearing. There was also a group of emails that was presented on which they were discussing the definition of the national security and the national security threat. And then you can see a lot of information here, and then there was a wording from Mike McDonald, I'm really not sure who he is, and said, Philip did some research which is handy to keep in our back pocket. So look at, and he used the, in quote, back pocket, because what it means is that they're just consistently working towards creating a narrative that is allowing them to stop the protest and freeze the funds, when the majority is clearly saying you are not doing our will. People who donated to a convoy, people who expressed their support either via social media or by going to bridges and places in different locations, clearly they were telling, we don't like what you're doing. So what is the government response? They block the money, they attack the crowd, they stomp the protesters. There is a disconnection. You're not hearing. You just want us to be quiet. So here, the Commission Councillor went a little bit deeper into the lack of definition of national security, and then they were discussing the fact that the national security was defined only by the examples of the CSIS. And we all know, because we've heard many times, that there is no proof of espionage, foreign activities, serious violence, and actions to overthrow the government. Once again, if anything, the convoy was ratifying the government. So the issue is that the Prime Minister was about to go live on TV saying there are threats to the national security, and nobody in the government was able to provide a definition of what that meant. So that's pretty interesting as well. Each official document up to that point was ratifying that the protest was peaceful. And what is interesting is that there is not finite timeline for when a lawful protest must end, because as long as it remains lawful, it may continue. So this was the problem. They didn't have the ability to close it. But what is interesting is that the lockdowns, the masks, and the restrictions to work and to socialize are not lawful. A mandate is not the law. So you can see here there is a contradiction, and obviously they don't care. Words matter. You can see how when she was asked about the difference between a lawful and unlawful protest, this was her answer. So they're talking about words that are being used when you're describing something as negative as cancer. So when these people understand, use these words, you can imagine the words that they use in these meetings where the notes are redacted. From the assessment of February 16, that this is after the Emergency Act was invoked, they were expecting this reaction. You can see it here. Civil unrest and degradation of social cohesion is common aftermath of pandemics. They know what they're doing. They know exactly that at a certain point in time, we grow impatient and we express our dissatisfaction with these mandates. And here, something interesting for Canadian historical context, in 1885, these requirements to curtail the smallpox in Montreal resulted in public violence throughout the city, with more than 2,000 people in the streets screaming, do this. So I'm not going to read so I don't get pulled down. Then it was time for the cross-examination, and I'm really liking these days Brendan. This is the Freedom Convoy counselor. He's doing a fantastic job, and he did an outstanding job with this woman. You can see his body language. He was ready for a good fight. So the question was, you spoke about the rule of law. What is your understanding of it? So she knew he was going somewhere because she responded very slowly. Laws that are obeyed by provincial, federal, and municipal levels. The question was, so you would agree that the rule of law applies to you and to the executive of the government of Canada? And she said yes, but she denied slightly with the head. The question was, your office was not created by the parliament, correct? And then she said, no, it's an advisor. And the question then was, you never worked for CSIS or any intelligence agency. You were never an intelligence analyst, correct? So were you satisfied with the CSIS report? And she said yes. And where he's going with this is, you're not an expert in intelligence. How do you dare to interpret what the CSIS is saying? So the question was, CSIS report to the cabinet stated there was no Section 2 CSIS Act threat posed by the protests or the actions through Canada. And then the answer from Jody was, you are misinterpreted what CSIS said. And then Brendan asked, how? What they said and the interpretation are very different things. Their mandate is very narrow. What? First of all, how is that related? The mandate is a mandate. Of course, they are not able to do anything and everything, but that has nothing to do with the fact that you cannot read an official report from an expert and then do your own interpretation. So clearly, she's going way beyond the scope of her role, and that's the point that Brandon wanted to show in this portion of the cross-examination. The question was, the threat to Canada is incorporated in the Emergency Act, is it not? And then the answer is, the definition is not limited by the CSIS Act. So obviously that's not true. So he said, we will agree to disagree. And then they moved on to the CSIS report regarding, and then Brendan read, the downtown Ottawa mood was actually quite festive, not threatening to passerbys. And then the speeches that were focused on the things that all of you who are listening know as true. And then he continued looking into the CSIS report. Very interesting, this part, a random flag is just a flag until the reason the person holding it explains it. So you can see how all these different problems that people run in when displaying Canadian flags or Quebec flags or any type of flag, Alberta, it doesn't matter. Clearly, that was an overreach because there is nothing wrong with holding a flag, even if it's a negative one. So that was very interesting. And then here you go saying that the presence of a specific flag does not necessarily mean that members of that group are in attendance. So that is obviously a given. Jody said, we advise the cabinet of the threat, the confidence on the government institutions. We have to look into more broadly. For example, online people saying this. I'm not going to read that, but we don't have the legal framework to do it. So the question from Brendan was, are you looking to look into metadata without legal framework? And then she said, no, we're violently agreeing. So who talks like that? You either agree or you don't agree, but you don't talk on the stand like that. She clearly feels very entitled. She clearly feels very protected. This is the first witness in 25 days that after the break didn't show up on time. The lead commissioner came out to restart the session. The woman was nowhere to be found. He had to say, I'll come back. And then after certain minutes, she came back to the stand. Who is she? Incredible. There is a gap in the legal framework, and I'm sure you're looking into how to close the gap right now. She said, we need a unit in public safety that does covert and overt information and makes an assessment because I don't have that now. She talks in first person. It's incredible, the entitlement. And the question was, why do you need something else? The answer, rather see it in a totality, not institution by institution. Well, that's your role, to collect it. So Brendan said, what about this? We get rid of your position. We let the director of CSIS to do what you do. And the answer was, the director is not the only one responsible for the security of this country. You can certainly make that recommendation. And then the parliament, the convoy counselor said, the parliament have not given you the authority to collect and analyze this data. And he walked away because the point is that she was appointed by the crime minister. She was not appointed by parliament. So clearly he is explaining, Brendan is telling her, you are going beyond the scope of your role. And I love that he walked away. This is the end of the second part. And this is how I see it. These mandates are the main tool of the genocide that is happening right now. I really want to thank the truckers and everyone who stood and continues to stand for our bodily autonomy, because you may think it's a little bit dramatic, but the reality is that our existence as a biological species is at stake. If you get changed by introducing technology in your body that is included in this, you're not fully human anymore. It's transhumanism. I have done multiple videos explaining this, including regulations from very old setups on which once you modify your DNA, you are a product, you're a slave, you can be trademarked. So if anyone who's listening has not looked into those videos, I'm more than happy to provide them to you. They're less than 10 minutes and clearly explain this is transhumanism. If enough of us do not stay unchanged, there is no more humanity. Thank you very much for listening.